Welcome to a Tech Moment on Cannabis Tech. I'm your host, Christina Etter. In this podcast, we take just a few minutes to talk about the exciting science and technology that is impacting the cannabis and hemp industries. And starting last year, we invited Matt Carr, who's the Chief Trends Strategist at the Oxford Club, onto the show to talk to us about investing in cannabis. And I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome Matt back today for 2021 and to talk about this new upcoming year, what to expect, the changes that happened in 2020 that are going to impact the investing industry or the investing in cannabis moving forward. So welcome back to the show, Matt.
Oh, well, thank you. Thanks for having me back. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Happy holidays. It just seems like I think everybody is just excited about 2020 coming to a close this year.
I know. I'm very excited for 2021. Put 2020 behind us. The markets did well. Our portfolios did very well. But there was so much other stuff in 2020 that I'm just ready to be done with.
Couldn't agree more. So let's get started on this year's, kind of the environment that the cannabis and hemp industries are looking at. But let's segue from the last podcast that we had, where we talked about the upcoming election and the different things that could impact the cannabis industry moving forward. Now that we know what the election results are, and I mean, it was amazing to watch 5 new states come on board with legalization of cannabis. So talk to me a little bit about how you feel the election results are really going to impact us moving forward in the cannabis and hemp industries.
You know, it really was an historic kind of year for the cannabis industry. You know, in the weeks leading up to that election, as I said on your podcast before, I said no matter who won the White House, cannabis would be that clear winner on election day. And I'm happy that's exactly what unfolded. We had those 5 states that had legalization measures on the ballot all get approved. Arizona, Montana, New Jersey, and South Dakota, they all greenlit adult use. Meanwhile, we had Mississippi give the thumbs up to medical. And in the blink of an eye, we now have 15 states in the District of Columbia that now allow for adult use and 36 states for medical. So this is a very interesting setup because just 4 years ago, in the 2016 election, 4 states legalized adult use: California, Maine, Massachusetts, and Nevada. And if we go back to 2012 election, Colorado and Washington became the first 2 states in the country to legalize recreational use. But this is a very historic kind of period because those Colorado and Washington votes were very important. Since those states greenlit adult use, support for cannabis legalization has risen 20 percentage points to a new all-time high. This is why we're seeing the market expand at a more rapid pace with each election. Now, as we look ahead to the year ahead, I'm still remain firm on my conviction that the global cannabis market is going to be worth $200 billion by 2030. And of that, the United States will represent about $80 billion. So these 5 states, they're going to bring in about $9 billion cumulatively of new revenue by 2025. So that's well on our way to those goals. So we know that Biden and Harris are in favor of legalization, particularly for medicinal. But here's my kind of takeaway from all of this, and it might be a little contrarian. At the federal level, I don't know how much really changes in the short term, right? So the last 8 years, it has been the states that have paved the way for legalization. In fact, if we go all the way back to California legalizing medicinal use in the 1990s, the states have really led the charge for legalization. So the problem is now cannabis has become this partisan issue. We saw this with the recent passage of the MORE Act in the House. Of the 164 dissenting votes, 158 of those were Republican. So unless the Democrats gain control of the Senate, which, we'll see what happens in the Georgia runoff races, the fact that it's controlled by Republicans at the moment, I think it'll continue to be a place where cannabis legislation goes to die, like we had with the Safe Banking Act. So at the federal level, besides having the support from the White House, I don't know if much changes until control of the Senate is flipped. If that happens, we'll have a lot of momentum because, the MORE Act, the Safe Banking Act, these are all going to have to be voted again in the new session. And if the Democrats control House and Senate, then some of that could move very quickly through Congress.
Right. There's just so much at stake right now. And, I have to say, it's a little disappointing, I think, for me to see cannabis become sort of this partisan issue. Because I know at one point in time, it seemed like everybody kind of agreed that we needed to start moving forward and that we needed to start making some changes to make business easier for cannabis entrepreneurs and for all of these states that have things legalized. I think everyone recognizes that banking has always been an issue and that we need to make changes there. So it's definitely, I hate to see everything in the world becoming such a partisan issue. And it seems like that's what's become over this last several years. Everybody's kind of chosen their sides and nobody wants to flex. So I'm really kind of hoping that maybe as we start to move forward, that some of those attitudes on the Republican side change. Honestly, I would love to interview somebody and find out where that hesitation lies. So it's very, very interesting to me to see what happens here.
Especially when you have such a majority of Americans that are in favor of legalization, not just recreational, but when you talk about medicinal, that jumps regardless of party, right? To these record levels. And I've talked to CEOs in the industry who've been frustrated by this partisanship because they were like, this is supposed to be a democracy where what the people want is what's moved forward. If the majority of people are in favor of legalization, why are these certain people standing in the way of it?
Completely agree. And it's very curious to me. I'm anxious to see how this all plays out this year. But let's go back and talk a little bit more about this state level. So like you talked about, 5 more states have voted in some form of marijuana legalization. So how do you foresee this kind of impacting cannabis investment opportunities or the market in general moving forward? I would think this would be a huge boost for everyone, and especially those investors in those states that are looking to, make that dive.
I think this is actually a very exciting time for cannabis investing because of not only those 5 states, which you do have some multi-state operators that are very well positioned, but because I think this also adds pressure on surrounding states to make a move towards legalization. With those 5 states, I think now we have another half dozen states in 2021 that could be considering adult use legalization this year. I think my home state of Maryland, which we already have medicinal, will probably debate adult use legalization. We know Connecticut's governor has already talked about adult use legalization in 2021. Pennsylvania's governor, which they already have this booming medicinal market, they're talking about adult use legalization. He's been pushing for it. And so he's been pushing those legislators to make some sort of move. And then I also think you can keep an eye on New Mexico, New York, Rhode Island, and Virginia having some sort of adult use. Now, with all that being said, 13 of the 15 states that have legalized adult use have done so through like a ballot measure. Illinois and Vermont have done it through legislative measures. So we'll see what happens there in the year ahead. But I think this is a very exciting time to be a cannabis investor because you are seeing this rapid expansion. You are seeing all of this pressure being put on some of these surrounding states to kind of move forward. We have both coasts that are filling in terms of adult use legalization. And there's this pressure that these states have to recoup, sort of tax revenue. You have to have more jobs put into place. You have to recover all of that damage that was done during the pandemic, and adult use legalization or some sort of medicinal legalization, that's right there to lend this helping hand on both of those fronts. So I think that will be the biggest impact as we go into 2021, that those 5 states are now putting pressure on all of their neighbors to make moves themselves or be at threat of losing those dollars, go to those states that have allowed adult use legalization.
I can't agree more. And so, one of the things that really kind of frustrates me from a cannabis consumer standpoint is when I hear people complain about the taxes that we have to pay for legalization. And, from my perspective, at least being here in Colorado, for us, we get enjoyment out of hearing how our tax dollars are being used. And we're seeing the good programs that are coming from it. We're seeing the scholarship programs. We're seeing the city beautification programs. We're seeing all of these things come from tax dollars. And I actually take pride in the fact in knowing that I have contributed in some way, shape, or form to those causes. And so I really think, from a just kind of a philanthropy standpoint, if people can see their tax dollars from the marijuana industry being put to good use like that, I think they'll have a change of heart, and nobody likes to pay taxes, of course, but I really feel like here in Colorado, at least, they're making an effort to at least show us where some of that money is going, and the cities are making an effort to really put that money to good use. So I am all for it. I think that after the pandemic, I think it's kind of a no-brainer to help bolster the economies and help rebuild things, just like you said. So I really hope that people kind of open up to the idea that, these taxes are doing good. We might not like to pay them, but we donate our money freely and willingly to charities and this cause and that cause, and we don't think a thing about it. And if you see your tax dollars actually being put to uses that you wouldn't mind even donating your money to, then I think that kind of changes that outlook on the taxes there. And I think we'll all see good come from this after the pandemic. So it's going to be interesting, I think, to see how these states build out these new programs.
Definitely, and of course, the cannabis industry also offers a higher wage than a lot of other retailers. So that's the other benefit there. That bud tenders and growers, any sort of like cultivator, you're making a really decent living.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. In comparison to maybe some of the other entry level positions that are out there that are paying minimum wage, I know the cannabis industry is well above that. So definitely, I see this being a great place for, people to get their feet, get back on their feet again and get re-entered into the job market, I think, after this pandemic is over. Now, back to the investor side of the market, though, as we look forward into 2021, what are some of the things that investors should be looking for in this new year? And do you have any cautionary notes that you want to give people as they start to move forward and look at this a little closer?
Sure. Now, what I would look forward to is, kind of those things that I outlined, that there are going to be these other, I think at least another half dozen states that are going to consider some sort of legalization in 2021. I don't know if all of them will will make some sort of legislative move, but that's showing that expansion of the market. On the cautionary side, there's a couple pieces that I really would pay attention to. First and foremost, I think you have sort of FOMO and euphoric optimism, that fear of missing out, that you really want to pay attention to. You don't want to go chasing shares just because shares are racing higher and that you think you've missed the bottom, you've missed the entry point. I'd pick your spots, wait for any sort of pullback. They're not going to always go up forever. But at the same time, I really don't think, as I look out into that cannabis space, I don't think there's a lot of companies that are really crazy overvalued from my perspective. I think we've seen a lot of them really kind of run up over the last several months, especially since that election. But I don't think anything's wildly overvalued because I thought we entered 2020 at these crazy depressed levels. Now, on the business side, there are some aspects that I would really pay attention to and be mindful about. And one of those you kind of see taking place in Pennsylvania and in Rhode Island. These are two states where there have been discussions of the states running the market, right? So that means, like the kind of proposed ideal in Pennsylvania, that adult use sales would go through state-run liquor stores. And in Rhode Island, that's being thrown around that the state not just regulate the market, but actually run it. So this would be actually kind of detrimental to multi-state operators. Generally, when you have a market expansion, especially into adult use, you have these players, especially major players, that have been sitting there kind of biding their time, taking a position, waiting for the market to come to them. If any of these states start going towards like the state-run or state-run liquor store route, that would be sort of problematic. The other thing to watch, which seems counterintuitive, and I'd really put it out there as like an outlier, is if the federal government moves too quickly towards some change at the federal level, right? So that would upend kind of what we have right now, which is the state-run market here in the United States. And though it has its positives, there's also like these downsides that you have to be aware of. Take a company like Innovative Industrial Properties, a company that I like. This is the Cannabis Real Estate Investment Trust that owns all these industrial properties across the United States, and then does these sale leasebacks to cannabis operators. So if you all of a sudden have some major change at the federal level where now there's all this interstate commerce, well, there's both parties get hurt on that. One, IIPR would get hurt because its assets devalued. Two, those operators would get hurt because they're locked into these sale leasebacks for, IIPR, about 15 years is what their average term left on their term is. Both of them would see their assets really devalue instantly. But again, as I outlined earlier with the Senate, I would put that as an outlier because I don't think that's going to be something that happens right away. But if something does happen right away, those would be an area that I would have some caution. So I think we'll gradually see a change at the federal level. Like I said, the Senate remains an issue, but those are my cautionary notes heading into this year, because I think we have the wind at our backs. A lot of members in the sector have done exceptionally well, but again, just not getting caught up in that FOMO, not chasing stuff higher, not putting yourself in a bad position, and then being mindful of these other issues at the state level with the possibility of, and I'm not quite sure the feasibility of it happening, but the states running the market, or too rapid of a change at the federal level.
Right. I find it very interesting that you brought in the state-run businesses, because in my previous life in the tech sector, my last job was with the city of Eden Prairie, Minnesota, and they had municipally run liquor stores there that contribute a large part of their budget. And I remember joking with my management team in there back in, this would have been 2014, probably, just as the legal rec side started coming on board. I said, would you consider municipal marijuana if Minnesota legalized? And we kind of joked about it in a meeting, but now it's kind of interesting to see that some states are considering approaches like that, and it's just fascinating to me to see how it all is gonna flush out in the end.
Yeah, they're just throwing out these ideas at the moment. So like I said, but those are things that I started reading, being like, oh, well, this is something to keep an eye on.
Right. It's going to be very interesting. So, and up to now, we have always heard that the ancillary businesses really are the best way to get involved in the industry, because you're non-plant touching. There's the old saying that when the gold rush, it's better to be in the pick and shovel business, when that happens. So I think people are kind of looking at the green rush in a similar note. Now, do you feel with federal legalization, do you think that advice is going to stick, or do you eventually see more opportunities to invest in actual plant touching businesses?
So personally, I've always been a proponent of having exposure to both sides. Companies like Grow Generation, Green Lane, Hydro Farm, IIPR, even Village Farms International. Those trade on major exchanges, so that's why they're more easily available to a much wider audience of investors. Their businesses are still considered legal by the federal government, even though the multi-state operators, their customers, aren't considered. So Grow Generation and IIPR, they had fantastic years this past year. Both of them I hold in about 3 different portfolios for my subscribers. So we had IIPR gained 146% roughly, plus it continued to increase its dividend. Grow Generation, which was my number one stock, my number one small cap for 2020, gained more than 850%. You also had Hydro Farm, had a fantastic IPO, gained 160% on its IPO. Village Farms rose about 80% this year. And then Green Lane, a little bit more moderate at that 25% level. But you also had companies like Akerna and Kushco that did really poorly. So that ancillary space had some of your best performers in terms of like growth generation, but also some of those sort of like bleak areas. So it had the brightest and the bleakest spots in the market. Now, when I talk about MSOs, I think there's actually a really great opportunity there, because when we look at that space, now all of these companies are seeing their revenues grow by a pretty substantial margin. But you had companies like Curaleaf, which is the largest multi-state operator in this country. Its shares almost doubled this year. Green Thumb Industries and Trulieve both saw their shares more than double. Planet 13, that kind of Dave and Buster's dispensary operator out of Las Vegas, their shares ran up more than about 200%. And then you had Jushi, which their shares shot up 345%. So there's that difference there. All of them did very, very well this year. You saw the ancillary have some of the bigger performances, but we now have these 9 American MSOs that are worth more than $1 billion. That's double, that's more than double actually, than what we had at the start of this year. So that's a really great setup. So I would continue to stress having exposure to both sides of that market, both the ancillary as well as the plant touching. They're both going to have their sort of ups and downs, but they're also going to see all this growth as the market expands. But here's the situation, and here's probably why you're going to continue to hear some ancillary plays can be seen as more safer, and that's because they trade on those major exchanges, the NYSE and the NASDAQ. When we look at a company like Curaleaf, again, largest multi-state operator, more than $200 million in quarterly revenue, sees about roughly 1 million shares traded each day. Grow Generation, largest hydroponics retailer in the United States, sees a little bit more than $200 million in annual revenue, sees more than 4 million shares traded per day. It's that liquidity, that's that biggest difference. That's the benefit of the major exchanges. So I like having exposure to both, but you have to understand that on those OTC markets, it's not going to be as liquid as it is on the NYSE and NASDAQ. But I think with 2021, as these markets continue to expand, both are going to be great opportunities. I would actually kind of say some of the MSOs are still trading at more of a discount to their future than actually some of the ancillary plays, but I would continue to have exposure to both.
Fantastic. It's incredible to me to hear those kinds of numbers in the legal cannabis industry already. You know, I just feel like we're still just kind of dipping our toes in the water, and we're still just kind of merging into this accepted legal practice. And it's just incredible to me to hear those numbers coming out of marijuana businesses already. I think it's just absolutely phenomenal.
It was amazing this year to see that, Green Thumb and Trulieve, they both became like and Curaleaf, the first companies to report in the sector over $100 million in quarterly revenue. Green Thumb has now reported more than $100 million in 3 consecutive quarters. Curaleaf is the first cannabis company ever to report more than $200 million in revenue. So that's the size of one I've been stressing over the years of the U.S. market compared to Canada. The Canadian, the licensed producers have the advantage of the international markets. But this U.S. market is very large, and you're right. We're just at the beginning of this sort of like updraft, and you're really seeing some real numbers come in that I think a lot of people wouldn't have believed several years ago.
Right. Right. So now let's dive a little bit deeper into obviously my favorite niche. So we are talking on cannabis tech. Let's talk a little bit about tech companies in particular. Are there any that you're seeing for 2021 that we should be watching?
Yeah, I still think in 2021 the focus, ERP, ERM, e-commerce, those are all going to continue to be kind of bigger players. I would hope to see Akerna see some sort of rebound. But the biggest one on the horizon is that IPO of Weedmaps, WM Holdings merging with Silver Spike to list directly to the NASDAQ. So this is one of those IPOs that kind of everybody has been waiting for, same along the same lines of like ease. And Weedmaps is following that path that was outlined by Cleverleaf recently. So I like that company. I like watching for that IPO and see how that's going to go, because that is an opportunity that's very interesting in the space because of that platform, because of that website. The other thing I like, there are these two tiny companies, very, very small, that I think are worth keeping an eye on. One is Cannabis Technologies, that has the cannabis breathalyzer test, which I think will be very interesting considering as the market continues to expand and there's this sort of need for that. And then Enwave, which does vacuum sealing as well as REV dehydration. Enwave had a tough year because it needs to go to places and install its machinery. Because of the pandemic, it couldn't do that. No one wanted to come in and run any tests. So I think both of those kind of have good years ahead of them. You would hope to see some sort of rebound. So I like all of those. And then I would also, for 2021, I would be keeping an eye on companies like Charlotte's Web, Hemp Fusion, which just IPO'd, CBSI, CB Sciences, all those CBD retailers, new age beverages. These are companies that they were so reliant on shelf space and retailers at grocery stores. Some of these companies were able to transition to direct to consumer. But as we start seeing all of these brick and mortars begin to reopen, as you start seeing this kind of return to normal, I think it's those CBD companies that could really start regaining a lot of the momentum that they have lost over this past year. And that'll spell a lot of good news for extractors.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think everybody's kind of looking to 2021 right now as that opportunity to rebound. Let's make up for some lost time that we had in 2020, and hopefully, the whole arrow scenario is that you pull back a little bit to launch yourself forward. So let's hope that maybe in 2021, some of this setting back and thinking about things a little bit has given us the opportunity to launch forward then in 2021. It's definitely going to be fascinating. I know that.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with you. I think we'll have a very exciting year, and I think there is this opportunity for this big bounce higher.
Absolutely. Well, Matt, I love having you on the show. It's always so fascinating to hear how things are going in cannabis investing and to hear your insight in the market. And so I hope that maybe we can continue this through 2021 and bring you back here in next quarter.
I would love to come back. I always enjoy coming here and talking with you. And I love talking to your viewers. So feel free to invite me back anytime.
Sounds great, Matt. And have a wonderful new year.
Same to you.